Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. So this is a very large topic to try to speak to in 15 short minutes. So this is going to really be what in English we call a bird's eye view of what some of the current challenges are. The 21st century, as Lisa has already said, has seen this widespread decline in democracy. According to many of the current indices on democracies, where different factors are rated across the globe, liberal democracies are at their lowest level in 25 years, and the US and several European countries have recently been demoted from full democracies to flawed democracies, which I think is fair. And with this, of course, is a rise in authoritarian regimes. Apparently now, elected authoritarian leaders, it's often called electoral autocracy, is now the most common regime in the world. So I don't think we need these scholarly academic indices, though, to get a sense of what's happening. Every time we read or look at the news, the newspaper today, we see these forces at play that basically the legitimacy of elections is being challenged. In the US, very much so, more recently in Brazil. Thank goodness they prevailed. That political norms are being done, that political violence is being condoned and supported. A recent poll, I believe it was 40% of Republicans in the US felt that political violence was perhaps necessary. And so this overall dismantling of democratic norms, and with it, I think, an eroding trust in government altogether, which is definitely concerning. So this is a relatively new research area for Toda, and I think basically we're really trying to understand what's going on and what can be done. So the research area seeks to examine what are the underlying and interlocking causes. It's clear that the various forces at play are influencing and augmenting each other. We can't just make a list of forces and say that's what's doing it. It's a very complex dynamic. We want to understand how this growing politics of fear is feeding upon global existential threats, whether it's climate change or pandemics or perceived threats, such as our national or cultural identity is being lost. And of course, also to think about how to foster countermeasures. How can we work to reverse some of these trends, whether it's at the level of policymakers, policy influencers, or civil society actors, media, etc. So I thought I would basically very briefly review what we've done so far at Toda, which is to have public conversations with scholars in some of these fields, which I think gives us a glimpse, at least, of what's going on. The first was with a couple of authors who've been writing specifically on democratic backsliding. And they did a study of 16 very diverse countries across the globe, modern Western democracies, poor developing countries, where this democratic backsliding is very visible. And one of the main things they noted was how consistent the major features are, despite very, very different social, economic contexts. And some of their primary takeaways, or one or two that I found particularly interesting, was the extent to which authoritarian-leaning leaders are now duly elected according to whatever in their constitutions. So it used to be that authoritarian leaders seized power through coups. Now they're being elected. and that they're using their executive power to incrementally erode core features of democracy. I think we saw this very clearly in Hungary with Orbán, where step by step the checks on executive power is removed, where the legislature becomes more and more under the control of the executive, where the independence of the judiciary is compromised and challenged. In fact, we're seeing that being proposed right now in Israel. The impacts, of course, are multiple. One of them, though, is that this incremental pattern catches both citizens and democratic institutions off guard. And I think that's been very much, I know, mine and others' experience in the US, where we so trusted that our democratic institutions would hold, and somehow you see them being undermined. I think in part because so many are really just based on norms, which are no longer respected. With it is coming this majoritarian conception of democracy, that if whatever party wins, whether or not they in fact represent a majority of the population, they get to set the political agenda. So the notion that a bedrock of democracy is pluralism is also being challenged, and minority rights threatened. With it comes this polarization of the electorate that Lisa has been speaking to the point, as Lisa said, where political adversaries are seen as unpatriotic. We certainly have seen this in the US, and as enemies of the state, and that too is very worrying. And that we're also seeing a kind of international contagion. Certainly the terms fake election, fake news, stolen election. Fake news, stolen election, it's spread all over the world. And leaders are being able to use that to their advantage. So there's a kind of copycat phenomenon. The efforts to overturn the election in Brazil and the attack on the Brazilian parliament looked very similar to what happened in the US on January 6th when our Congress was attacked. So what are the remedies? Obviously, that's a huge question, but clearly we can no longer take democracy for granted. It's clearly something that takes active work. I'm sure it always did, but that's being really brought home, and the importance of early awareness as these things start to be eroded. Also understanding the kind of core grievances that is fueling some of this polarization, which I think requires more attention to how public services and goods are delivered, the sense that things aren't being unfairly done. I can't count on the government to serve my needs. That's easily manipulated by leaders exerting more authoritarian power. Preventive political reform where possible. Again, in the US, we've seen that so much has been based on norms, and so it's a question of how elections can be manipulated. So how can we shore up the political structures to protect our democracy? And then there's this question of how democracies can perhaps support each other. If we're having this international contagion towards autocracy, how do we create more international contagion towards really supporting democratic norms? So just to, I think Lisa touched on this, but the most recent report from one of these major indices of democracy really stressed this level of toxic polarization that's so much on the rise across the world, again, in modern Western democracies, poor developing countries, that's notably increasing. And that there's actually been a rise in coups, so that this tendency towards just an incremental erosion of democracy, that may be changing, that authoritarian leaders are starting to exert more forceful means. So actually, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit over these slides, which we can always come back to in the conversation, but this was based on a conversation we had with somebody who has thought a lot about how democracies rose and fell in the 20th century. So it's not an entirely new phenomenon. We saw, of course, if you think about what happened in Germany in World War II with the collapse of their economy and loss of national pride, how that gave rise to Hitler, so that we had these flowerings of democracy and then rises of fascism in a kind of cyclical way. So there are many lessons to be learned from that and how we resist that kind of rise of tyranny. But we could come back to that if we have time. We also spoke with a woman who's been writing on the rise of the extreme right across the globe. She points to the statistic that there's been over 300% increase in right-wing extremism in the last 7 years across the globe. And some of the major features that she noticed in this is basically an opposition to the whole notion of equality, that people get categorized in groups, and that groups are ranked according to a hierarchy around who really belongs to this country and who really has rights in this country, and very anti-immigrant. And that these ideas are being more and more mainstreamed in politics. So it's in many ways given the appearance of being less fringe, political parties forming around it, as I'll speak in a moment around what's happened in Sweden. Clearly, many, many contributing causes. She speaks to the extreme inequality, the sort of 1% versus the 99%, the billionaires or zillionaires that control so much wealth, the ways in which that feeds conspiracy theories of a global elite. In the US, it gets referred to as the deep state, the World Economic Forum, these groups that are controlling everything for their own gain. And of course, this sense for many that they're not able to live to the same standard of living that their parents or grandparents did, that there's a sense of losing status. This has certainly happened for a lot of middle-class white Americans in particular. And that also this erosion in the faith of democracies to deliver, just a mistrust that they can deliver. And clearly democracies are challenged as the world becomes very, very complicated, and huge migrations, people amassing at borders, certainly in the US at our southern border. And then, as Lisa has been saying, social media and disinformation clearly becomes a great accelerant and augmenter of all of this. In terms of talking about what can be done, the scholar was pointing to the dangers of demonization of the far right. Clearly, violence coming from the far right needs to be, a strong stand needs to be taken. But it should also be understood that many people from the far right feel that they're acting altruistically. In their minds, they're maintaining core cultural, core moral values that are being undermined in modern times. And so when they're just demonized, that tends to lead to them becoming more polarized, more entrenched, more determined to fight against what they see as corrupting forces. So it seems so important to understand those drivers as well as this anxiety over the loss of status. Wanted to mention Sweden. We had a very interesting interview with a political scientist and political psychologist from Sweden about the fact that the Sweden Democrats, which in fact have their roots in neo-Nazism, it's now the second largest party in Sweden, and in the elections of last fall, they got 20% of the vote. I think this was a shock in Sweden and certainly in many other parts of the world of how did this happen? We all think of Sweden as this very democratic, progressive, pluralistic society that in the past has welcomed immigrants. According to her, this was done through a real focus on crime, which in fact has been on the rise in Sweden, and linking it to immigration. The research doesn't hold up that it is in fact linked, but that was, those facts were manipulated in the sphere of losing Swedish culture. So, and this effort to redefine who is Swedish. And they're linking to other European far-right parties. And I think this internationalization of the far right is also something that's definitely happening and to be concerned about. So I want to stop there and say that in terms of next steps, we're looking at how to broaden our global perspective around these threats, understand how it's affecting many different parts of the world, the new dangers posed by toxic polarization, and to identify points of entry for countermeasures and positive change. So thank you.
What about the problem of distrust towards the mainstream media? Can I speak in Japanese?
Yes.
So, 大学で教えている人間なんですね。で、社会教育にも携わってます。メディア不信がとても広がっていると思います。新聞を読まない、ニュースを信じない。で、自分たちのチョイスで、メディアを選んでいるという傾向が若者たちだけでなくて大人たちにも広がっていますね。で、それの背景にあるのがメディアは自分たちのニーズに応えていない、知りたいことを知らせてくれていないという感覚で、これは学者に対しても向けられるわけです。先生たちが言ってることは私たちの関心に応えてないっていうわけですね。この問題は大きいので、質問はですね、これ植民地主義と関係あるんじゃないかっていうことなんです。つまり今ウクライナ報道について、日本ではウエスタンメディアって言いますかね、西側の報道がメインなんですね。ですがグローバルサウスを見るとかなりロシアの報道を見てるんですよ。で、そこでのそのディバイドが非常に深刻で、そして西側メディアへの不信というのは根深いものがあるんですね。植民地時代以来と言っていいと思います。そのコロニアリズムの問題をどうお考えになるかというのが最初のお二人への質問ですね。
Sure. No, that was an excellent question. Thank you. And parts of it are hard to answer. But in terms of, I think you're absolutely right that it's not just young people who are relying on social media for their news. It's also adults. I know that's very much the case in the US. And there's such a sharp split between the political right and the political left in terms of who listens to what, whether that's television news, whether that's what they see on Facebook or whatever. And they're very, very different narratives of what's actually going on. So that leads to this tremendous amount of mistrust. I think the problem was exacerbated when Trump early on in his administration basically said the media is the enemy, that you can't trust what you hear. And that sort of eroded, I think, this basic sense that has been cultivated for so long that mainstream newspapers, they do a lot of fact-checking. If they hear something from an anonymous source, or they use an anonymous source, it always has to be corroborated by several other sources, that there's this triangulation of information. So even though I think by our major newspapers, those standards are still upheld, it's no longer trusted. by those that disagree with what they read. So there isn't this consensus on what are the facts. That is a huge problem and not so easy to address. In addition to that, though, I think you also make a really important point that it's not just the facts that are contested, but also these very different narratives. And those different narratives are different within a country, but you're making the very important point that they're different globally as well, and that some of the roots of that are no doubt founded in colonialism, and that colonial powers' narratives have been privileged for far too long. So I think it's a really important question of what can be done about that. I remember somebody in one of our recent discussions at Toda the other day was commenting that after 9/11, I believe it was, that Al Jazeera held some kind of a television program in which they invited people from Middle Eastern countries and Western countries to speak together about what had occurred at 9/11 and share different perspectives and to try to understand different perspectives. And I think that's something that our world needs so much more of, how to create these sort of public squares or public domains where different perspectives can be shared between the global south, between the developed west, et cetera. So thank you for the question. It's so important.